For nearly 30 years, for at least a week each summer, I've had the privilege of being able to be a part of a Christian summer camp for young people in Scotland, just a few miles north of Dundee. I have some general leadership responsibilities, along with teaching a young adult class each morning and preparing the nightly hot chocky that tastes jolly good for the campfire. And yes, you really need to be there to understand how important that is. Well, each year we have a theme around which our morning classes and other activities are based. And this year our theme was mystery. We were looking at Jesus and asking why he came into the world, why he had to die and then be raised from the dead, and what it means that he now reigns in his kingdom and what is yet to come. Well, on the Tuesday evening, I gave a talk to the whole camp on why Jesus needed to die on the cross. And we began by the Sea of Galilee, with Jesus standing by the water. Luke tells it like this. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. That's one of several names by which the lake is known. And he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signalled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. I remember many years ago now standing beside Lake Malawi in the dark hours of the night and looking out and seeing lights on the water far away in the distance. I came to understand that they were fishing boats far out from the shore, using their lights to attract the fish so that they could be caught in the nets, or maybe by some other means. I had been out on the lake earlier that day with a handful of Malawian fishermen and experienced for myself something of the challenges they must have faced on a daily basis. It was a small wooden boat, powered only by the hard work of the men paddling frantically either side. The water became rather choppy, and one of the men towards the front of the boat was thrown off into the water as we crashed into a large wave which threw the bow violently upwards towards the sky. Well, he managed to get back on board, and none of the others seemed particularly concerned. In fact, they seemed to have found it all rather amusing. Well, as the boat began to fill with water, I was passed a bucket with which to bail it out, and did so with enthusiasm. These four hard-working fishermen spoke not a word of English, and my grasp of Chitumbuka was, well, essentially non-existent, so I didn't really have much idea of what was happening, but it was all rather exciting. Well, as I later watched the lights on the boats in the distance, far from the shore of what is the 9th largest lake in the world, I wondered what sort of night they were having out there. You know, were the waters rough? Had any of them fallen into the depths? Was the boat filling with water as ours had been doing? And then, of course, had they caught any fish? And then I thought of this episode when Jesus climbed into Simon's boat and, after teaching the people, told him to put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. Well, having just washed their nets after a fishless night on the lake, Simon had already demonstrated his willingness to help Jesus by allowing him into his boat and by putting it out a little from the land so that he could teach. Now, despite his certainty that nothing would be caught, he was being asked to let down the clean nets once more into the water. They must have been exhausted. I mean, maybe they were just longing to go home to their families, have a cup of tea and take a nap. But, well, Simon knew that the one who was telling him to go back out onto the lake was to be respected above all others, even if he wasn't a fisherman. So he did as he was told, as also did his partners, Jacob, whom we know as James, and John. Well, one can only imagine the excitement and incredulity of Simon and his fellow fishermen as they hauled the nets full of fish into their boats. I suppose Jesus must have helped them with this enormous catch with a sense of joyfulness, I'm sure, maybe even amusement, as Simon and his partners saw him demonstrate his authority in such a profound fashion. I mean, they'd seen it before. But here he was demonstrating his authority in their own arena of life. And I suppose they must have been thinking, was there nothing he couldn't do? And thank goodness there were no fishing quotas in those days, yeah? Nobody to say they had caught too many fish. I mean, it must have been quite a sight. Well, as the nets were stretched to the limits and beginning to break, as the boats filled up and began to sink lower in the water, out in the depths of the lake, Simon Peter fell down at Jesus' knees, surrounded by floundering fish, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Never before had they seen such a thing. And less honourable men might have seen in this episode an opportunity for growing their fishing business, but not Simon Peter. He seems to have been overwhelmed, not with any sense of greed whatsoever, but with a clear awareness of his own failings and inadequacies. He didn't need Jesus to tell him he was a sinner. That was plainly obvious to him in light of the greatness of the one before whose knees he had fallen. And when we see something of the greatness of God, nobody needs to tell us we're sinners. That should be blatantly obvious to all but the most arrogant. Thinking of Simon Peter in his boat, confronted by the overwhelming evidence of the authority of Jesus. Well, thinking of that took me back to when the prophet Isaiah saw his vision of the glory of the Lord filling the temple. This is what he tells us. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Isaiah didn't need to be told by these seraphs, or by anyone else for that matter, that he was a man of unclean lips. The presence of the glory of the Lord compelled him to acknowledge what was clearly evident to him. And far from being lost, he was then cleansed, and soon found himself in the service of the Lord as one of his spokesmen. And so here, on the Sea of Galilee, Simon has no option other than to be completely honest about his own failings and shortcomings in the presence of the Lord of all creation. And in his presence he urges Jesus to leave him. But the Lord will have none of it. He knows all of our failings and inconsistencies, and he says to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. Isn't that amazing? You know, the story that Luke tells us of this miraculous catch of fish, amazing as that truly was never all about the miraculous catch of fish. It was really about enabling us to understand something of the character of Jesus and something of the nature of his mission. Not only is Jesus more than accepting of sinners, but he has work for those whom he catches, that they might catch others too. It wasn't the righteous whom Jesus had come to save, but the sinners. And it isn't the so-called righteous who are most suited for the service of God, but those who recognize their unrighteousness. Only then can we allow God to cleanse us, to forgive us of our failings. And only then can we, in all integrity, share that message of forgiveness with others. In order to understand and so participate in the mission of God, we must first recognize his absolute authority over us, over all things. And we must accept his authority over us. Understanding his complete supremacy enables us not only to better recognize our own failings, but also to recognize that it is always God who is in control. The miracle of the catching of the fish becomes a symbol of mission. The mission of God that lies at the heart of the message of the Gospels. The mission of God is never a matter of human ingenuity. It's never a matter of having to use the latest technology in order to sound out the whereabouts of the largest shoal, as it were. The mission of God is always just that. It is of God. We simply sow the seed, or in this case, cast the net, and God will provide the people. And to participate in the mission of God is to work with him as partners in this fishing business. So I was giving a talk about why Jesus needed to die on the cross. And we began by the Sea of Galilee, because each one of us has had to have our moment in the presence of God when we've come to see ourselves for who and what we really are. We've come to see ourselves as not being what we could be, not even being what we should be, but as part of humanity with all of its imperfections and inconsistencies. It all began in the garden when Adam and Eve realized that they had messed up everything and they hid from God. You remember that? Separated from God, they died in their sin, and death and suffering came into the world. It was ruined. It looked like there was no hope of anything ever being right again. Somehow, somebody needed to come to change all of that, to make things better, to make things the way they were in the beginning. And we've all done the same. None of us is better than anyone else. We've all missed the mark. We've all fallen short. And in our failings, we've found ourselves separated from God. You know, we've been ashamed. We've been embarrassed. Maybe we've hidden. Maybe we've even told God to leave us alone, as Simon did on the boat. But he won't do that. And he won't do that because he loves us. And because he loves us, he came to take away the death, the suffering, the shame. He came to take away everything that's wrong about the world. God sent his Son to suffer the pain, to die the death, if you like, on our behalf. And only he could do it, because only he had brought no sin and death into the world. Unlike us, he was never a part of the problem. He was only ever the solution. Thanks be to God for our Lord Jesus.